the high level, the high point of our discussions, of our focus on negotiation. Our topic in this second session in the morning is on negotiation opportunities and challenges, in that order, if you will, that lie ahead in the short term. And you have the biographies. I won't spend a long time in presenting people, because it would take too long to present any one person, and four is even a bigger challenge. We will first hear from Ambassador Thomas Pickering, who used to be Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and then also Ambassador to the United Nations, Russia, India, Israel, Nigeria, Jordan, and El Salvador. He never made it to Sri Lanka. And then after that, Ambassador Princeton Lyman, who was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at a time for African Affairs, and Ambassador to Nigeria and to South Africa, and most recently was the Presidential Special Envoy for both Sudan and South Sudan. And the third speaker then will be Dr. Galia Golan, who was head of the Political Science Department, both but not at the same time, in Hebrew University and in Herzliya in the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, and has the author of a number of books on the Israeli-Palestine situation, and most recently one on the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and received awards from International Studies Association and from the Israeli Political Science Association. And concluding in this stellar array is our own dean, Vali Nasr, who was recently the special advisor to the president's special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, that is Ambassador Holbrooke, and has been on the state's foreign policy, or is on the state's foreign affairs policy board, and has also written a number of books on that area of the world. So within that short recall, really, of the people who are here, I think we'll begin. We've asked each to give a kind of a 10-minute presentation of their views of the opportunities and challenges that we have for negotiation in the time ahead of us. Tom, you want to begin?
Thank you, Bill, very much. It's a delight to be here. Let me do the best I can to compress the challenges ahead. I'm delighted to see you all and delighted that you're here, and I know that this is going to be an amazing and very helpful time of stimulating emotions after 5 weeks of total tranquility on the American political scene. I think that I will only mention the fact that we go into this with a man whose, I think, watchwords in negotiation are based on bankruptcy, bullying, and BS. And as a result, the situation looks fairly difficult. But let me, if I can, sketch out some issues that are out there and before us, which in a time of perhaps greater sanity might lend themselves to this kind of work. Because I found that for the period since November 8th, any capacity to predict what's coming next in a world where virtual reality has replaced government is very, very difficult, and where the inventing solutions for problems that don't exist seems to be a new national pastime. But leaving all of that aside, I would say that in a world of tremendous and very rapid change, and many of the factors that are out there are, in a sense, part and parcel of these problems, I'd like to mention 6 sets of issues on which I think there are distinct and potentially useful negotiating possibilities, even if in many ways very difficult ones. Begin with essentially great power rivalries, certainly with Russia. We need coherence, good sense, and a next step in reducing the number of nuclear weapons on both sides. We seem to be prohibited by Putin's reservations from getting there. Trump's blandishments don't seem to have yet opened the door. Several of the precursors for that may well be in the field a clear sense of how and in what way ABM cooperation could be designed and usefully pursued. And in a world of perhaps more what one would call logic and rationale, that would be an important step. There's also the Ukrainian problem that sits in the way, but I don't think it's an impossibility. I think one has to begin on the Ukraine with the economic differences and see whether a large international program could be an inducement to repair both a bad economy and a bad polity, dealing with everything from corruptions to language discrimination. But Ukraine has every possibility, in my view, of for the next 2 decades being a better bridge country than one fought over by both sides. And those particular ideas, in my view, are somewhere at the heart of moving ahead. I think that we move on to the China problem, where I think we have not much terribly in common. Although I think solving the South China Sea by trying to enforce navigation rights is merely putting the heat up under the pressure cooker where the valve is welded shut. You need a door through which to think about walking through. And that door, in my view, is primarily based on the fact that 70% of China's trade moves through the South China Sea, and that keeping the lanes open, sea and air, for that is a fundamental area of common agreement. And were we able to reach agreement on a one-sentence communique that says we're both committed to doing that, we would have begun the destruction of the fiction of the 9-dash line. But we would open the door for other agreements in the region that I think could be pursued. And if there's time when your questions come up, I will give you some sense of the follow-on. But those are major questions. I think that we need to avoid destroying Europe or allowing Europeans to destroy Europe, but I don't have a formula for that. One will hopes that the French will vote early, wisely, and often, and that the Germans and the Dutch will too, and that my friends in Europe who are confecting an Article 50 legislation for the British Parliament will at some time build into that the notion that the people of the United Kingdom will yet have another choice between what seems to me to be, to borrow a phrase, the truly bad deal that Mrs. May is condemned to make with the Europeans on the one hand, and what they already have with the EU on the other, which seems to me to be important. Moving on to the Middle East, I think Syria pops out as a major question, and Saudi-Iranian differences are the heart of one of the many plays going on in the Middle East for contests for hegemony and for difficulty, and could lead to difficulty. Yemen may be a starting place where exhaustion is beginning to take its toll, and where Saudi success is certainly, in my view, not measurable on any real standard, and where the Iranians have jumped onto an opportunity rather than, I think, created one by malevolent meddling in Houthi politics. And so it is, in that sense, ripe for a move from feckless war to hopefully toward some kind of a negotiated solution. And that in itself would help to begin to bridge the gap, the early abutments of which we now see in the Kuwaiti foreign minister's visit to Tehran, and some invitations to Saudis also to go there, which seem to be on the verge of acceptance. An Iranian-Saudi capacity to work together on Syria is not necessarily truly a bad thing. It could be very helpful in moving that ahead. I think in Syria, a ceasefire is splendid and a very important step, and even if it doesn't universally hold. But I think the traditional view that transitional government, a new constitution, and public approval of some kind through an electoral process as the next 3 steps raise serious difficulties. My own sense is that whatever next step should be taken should reinforce the ceasefire and not yet adumbrate the question of who runs Syria in the future too early. And that, in my view, should be a technocratic facility that might look like a government, but would put Syrians of technical capacity and administrative achievement in charge of such things as turning the water back on, dealing with the rubble and the roads, and beginning to open up both medicine and education again to young Syrians, to consolidate the ceasefire and begin something that pretends to be a proto-government, which could lead toward dealing with the governmental issues which are now so politically divisive. So let me hop on. Galia, I'm sure, will tell us about Middle East peace. I am terribly disappointed that the Obama administration didn't take their steps to the final stage of Security Council approval. It would have been, in my view, a real addition to where we are. And both the settlement question and the question of the carry or similar principles are significant in helping to set the stage for something, whether it will come sooner or later, and whether that requires, in a sense, the replacement of the leaders in the area to get there is a huge challenge. 4 or 5 other issues I think are out there, and I'll mention them very briefly. Otherwise, I'll have consumed all of the time, all of the oxygen, and even maybe all of the insomnia in the room. But I think that weapons of mass destruction remain important, and I talk about U.S.-Russian leadership there. I think we need to continue to give serious attention to the idea of, can you get to zero weapons, and our new conventional military capabilities beginning to serve as a potential important deterrent to breakout of individuals, to the one-eyed man is king syndrome, which tends to hang over this particular set of ideas, but which I think in its way is subject to resolution with determination. And the Gang of Four, Perry, Schultz, Nunn, and Kissinger, had the right idea when they pulled this issue out of the closet and said it's worth spending time on. I think poverty, growth, and development remain out there as an alarming and difficult and seriously challenging problem. And I think better work in food, in agriculture, in health, in medicine, and some real attention to energy questions, and looking at the challenge of development not as a silver bullet answerable solution, but as something confected country by country with national leadership is a very important way of proceeding. And it involves a negotiation of, I think, the most primordial importance as we move ahead. And it requires a great deal more donor collaboration than we see in this process ahead, and much less competition. And certainly the fact that State Department and EPA are being cut to make tanks and planes is not a good harbinger of future U.S. interest in this particularly demanding and important problem as we go ahead. Energy, climate change, and environment, all very much closely linked, are also extremely significant. One wonders whether there hasn't been time yet to tear up Paris, either literally or figuratively, along with Iran and other things, or whether, in fact, we're going to go anywhere in that area. But I would do everything I could to encourage moving down the particularly important role of next steps on climate change as a negotiating challenge, however divorced from reality that particular council may seem at the present time. And I think finally, we have a big challenge before us. The world economy has stumbled forward from 2008 to 2009 into what we would call a very slow roll recovery. And the lessons we have picked up along the way have not, in my view, yet been carefully translated either domestically or internationally into the kinds of institutional arrangements which can help us both guard against a return, but also put us in a stronger position as a congery of world economies to build, strengthen, and advance our approach to the question. So a final set of advice in the negotiating and policy range: wars haven't settled problems very well. They are not a good substitute for diplomacy. We should begin with diplomacy and development as we approach issues. Use wars only as a last resort and only, in my view, to defend vital interests. And Harry Truman once famously said, vital interest for the United States is survivability and prosperity and to that I would add of our friends and allies. Thank you.
I like Tom's creative optimism. And I'm going to deal with issues, particularly of conflict, conflict where we see not only conflict, but we see atrocities, we see instances approaching genocide. And what I would argue at the outset is that the conditions that breed these conflicts and also often massive atrocities are going to be with us for some time. In Africa, we've seen the loss of millions of lives, but not only in Africa. None of the issues that led to the Arab Spring, whether it was democracy or employment or opening to the modernized world, have been resolved. They lie waiting for the next confluence of events that erupt into explosion or terrorism or new forces of repression. We see some of those same forces in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other areas in South Asia. And the challenge for practitioners, for mediators, is that most of the driving forces of conflict lie outside the role of the mediators. They are beyond their mandate or control. Listen to Vasu Gundan, founder and director of Accord, one of the premier conflict resolution organizations in Africa. He says, "The pressures on African society today are greater now than ever before. For the first time in the history of humanity, we face the convergence of factors that threaten our very existence. Exponential population growth, rapid urbanization, climate change, and a global financial crisis are all converging at the same time, a phenomenon unprecedented in the history of humanity with huge complexities. For developing countries like ours, this will exacerbate poverty, unemployment, and inequality." Or Egosa Osagai, who writes of the conflicts in Nigeria going on, not just Boko Haram, but the vicious conflicts going on between nomads and agriculturists as they fight over scarce land and water resources. And he says, issues of contested citizenship, resource inequalities, uneven development, political exclusion and marginalization, add to that governance failures of a weak state, the inability to cope with the unusual, unconventional, and new forms of conflict like Boko Haram or in the Niger Delta, the ethnic riots of the Fulani, etc. These are all, he says, prototypical. And they are fueled, he says, by the forces of globalization. We see such violence, such use of violence, such attacks on civilians, and viciousness with ISIS and others in the Middle East, and sometimes in Southeast Asia. Now, I would add to that the so-called youth bulge in Africa and the Middle East. Africa has the youngest population in the world. They represent 60% of the unemployed. In the Middle East, 65% are under the age of 30. And what is significant is that the opportunities for employing this population are diminishing, facing governments with impossible pressures. There's a recent study, short study by the National Defense University on the impact of the combination of robots, artificial intelligence, and 3D printing that is going to change dramatically the placement and nature and employment of industrialization. And what that may mean for developing countries faced with this youth bulge is that the traditional path out of unemployment and to industrialization, the labor-intensive industries like textiles or small efforts in computers, et cetera, they may disappear. And that we'll need whole new economic paradigms for dealing with the employment pressures that these countries are facing. And I don't see those economic paradigms yet. So what is the practitioner's role? What is the mediator's role in this world when faced with conflict and having no control, no mandate over all these underlying factors that are producing these pressures? Peacemakers may give lip service to the need for these underlying causes to be addressed. And peace agreements will say, we're going to take care of this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to do other things. But they rarely incorporate the implementation or the dramatic changes to political, environmental, and economic policies that would be needed. So what do we do? What do we do as peacemakers? Well, we rely on a number of rather traditional, tried, and sometimes true methods. One is to appeal to leaders to avoid exacerbating the conflicts and get them to at least contain them with a combination of pressures on the one hand, enticements on the other. And this has worked in some cases. It's worked in South Africa. It worked in Kenya in 2007. It works to a limited extent in the Central African Republic. And it worked in some other cases. But there are few Mandelas and de Klerks in the world today. It has not worked in South Sudan or Syria or Yemen or even in Myanmar, where a democratic administration cannot deal with the problems of the Rohingya. And where appeals to mediate to leaders fails, mediators look to regional and international actors to pressure them. We use sanctions, we use peacekeepers, sometimes military intervention. And now we've added to the mix accountability through the International Criminal Court. But it's questionable whether we, the United States in the future, is going to have the ability and the capacity to mobilize collective action along all these regards. Take South Sudan, an area that I've worked on for a long time and which is in a horrible, deplorable situation. The regional organization that is in charge of the peace process, the Intergovernmental Association for Development, IGAD, insists on being in charge, but refuses to take the actions necessary to end the conflict. And the U.S., so divided over its own policy in this regard, was unable to move the needle in any way. Perhaps it is best to stop talking of never again. That slogan implies that the world will feel such revulsion at mass atrocities that it will organize to contain and stop them. But that is not true, as countless such atrocities have taken place over the last few decades, and with at best mixed results in containing them. And as I've suggested, the pressures for more such violence is pulsating within societies in many places in the world. Maybe what we should do better is to prepare ourselves for continuing outbreaks of such violence, sometimes vicious and horrible, and recognize that without addressing the underlying causes, the best we as practitioners can do is put Band-Aids on them, contain them to a degree, postpone them a little bit more into the future until the next time, or until we finally get new leadership and new paradigms that will address the underlying problems. There is, of course, one more thing we could do, but but as often as I have argued this with colleagues around the world, and especially with the humanitarian agencies, we always come to the same conclusion, that it's impossible to do what I'm about to suggest. But let's look at it once again. One of the standard responses to conflict is to provide humanitarian assistance to the victims. It's the politically easiest thing to do, and it makes a lot of sense. It shows we are doing something, and it helps the victims. But in effect, with now such massive amounts of such aid, we are paying for the wars. The U.S. alone is providing $2 billion a year in humanitarian aid to South Sudan, and doing it against the wishes, if you will, the actions of both sides in the war. more than 60 aid workers have been killed trying to get humanitarian aid in this situation to the people who are involved. And there are more than 1.5 million refugees who have flowed into neighboring countries. And UNHCR, with our support and other support, immediately provides the tents and the food and the care for the refugees. But supposing we didn't do that? Supposing we said to Uganda, those 500,000 refugees are yours. You're not doing much to end this war in your neighboring country. You're not, as a member of IGAD, doing enough. So why don't you pay the price for 500,000 refugees? Why don't the leaders of South Sudan have to pay the price for the humanitarian disaster? Well, of course, we never will reach that conclusion, and I don't suggest that we do. But we do need to look then at new paradigms, new ways to confront the forces which will almost surely lead people and their leaders to tear each other apart and to find new ways to manage these forces, both long-term and immediate. This has to be our task. And if mediators and negotiators do not raise these issues, who will? Thank you.
Well, I think I'm going to need more than 10 minutes to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, except that Trump's going to make this great deal. I'm waiting. Well, more power to him. What I want to talk about are basically the challenges. I must admit that that's sort of what we are facing. And I'm going to talk about past negotiations and the lessons from the past negotiations, and I'm going to talk about basically the things that remain with us, because there are a lot of things that went into the factors that led to past failures. But there's some things that are with us and are going to return, and if we ever have negotiations again. And the first one that I found to be absolutely critical, going all the way back, was mistrust, beyond the usual mistrust of the other side. And I'm talking about Israeli negotiators, where the feeling was, the conviction was, that the Arabs would never make peace with us, they would never accept us in the region, and even if they signed an agreement, it wouldn't last. This, by the way, persisted, this conviction. Even Yitzhak Rabin told President Ford, no Arab leader will ever make genuine peace with us, but he said it could change. We have to have a long period of testing and so on. So that was the beginning of a different attitude. It changed entirely with Olmert, and then it went right back with Netanyahu under the guise of the no partner. No partner on the other side. It's impossible. It'll never happen. And if it happens, you can't trust it. But the point of this is this mistrust has been so strong, and is once again today, that there was always, when a peace offer was there on the table, possible, there was a preference amongst Israeli leaders for security precautions. Even when they knew those security precautions were deal breakers, whether it was with Jordan, whether it was with Syria, whether it was with the Egyptians, we could have done without the Yom Kippur War, and with the Palestinians to this day. So I think the major challenge that has returned is this mistrust, and therefore the preference for basically deal breakers, demands for security arrangements. I'm speaking specifically of a Israeli military presence in the Jordan Rift Valley, that is the border between a future Palestinian state and Jordan. And I could give many examples of this, but this mistrust is linked to the issue of legitimacy. The issue of legitimacy, and for Israelis in our region, that also means identity. The idea of the right, our right to be in this place, meaning there, our right as Jews to have a state in that particular place. And I give you an example of, I would think, a misunderstanding of this hang-up, which is legitimate, is a hang-up of legitimacy, where Arafat, for example, greatly underestimated the issue of Jerusalem and the importance of Jerusalem for Israelis. And I think, by the way, that was the one mistake he made at Camp David, because Jerusalem symbolically, geographically and symbolically, is the symbol of our connection to that specific place. And Arafat said, well, the temple was probably not even in Jerusalem and so forth. I think that was a misunderstanding of this issue for Israeli negotiators. And this comes into another thing that happens in negotiations with Israelis, and it's linked to this legitimacy and our place in this physical geographic area. And that's this idea that a conception, and I think we've had of every Israeli leader to this day, with no exceptions, and that is that this area, this land, is ours. From the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, maybe even beyond, it's ours. The difference between somebody like Begin or Netanyahu and Rabin was, Rabin himself said the difference between the right wing and the labor is that it's ours, no question of that, but we are willing to give up some of it. It's, in other words, this concept that it's ours is an exclusive one. It's proprietary. It's not just that we have certain rights in this area, that maybe others have certain rights in this area. It's exclusive and proprietary. And this means that in negotiations themselves, you have this attitude of the Israeli negotiator goes in there and says, this is ours, but we're going to be generous. We're going to maybe give you some of this. Instead of approaching negotiations from the point of view, as one Palestinian negotiator put it, instead of from the point of view of these are your needs, these are our needs, like interests, an interest-based negotiation. That has yet to happen. And connected with this is another thing, and that's the asymmetry of the situation, which has been pointed out. But again, Israeli negotiators tend to ignore the asymmetry, which obviously is there. Rob Malley and Hussein Agha pointed out after the Camp David talks that Israeli negotiators acted as if there were symmetry, as if basically we're equals and we will give a little and you'll give a little. We'll make a compromise and you'll make a compromise. And Netanyahu later called it, we give, you give. It's reciprocity, he called it. It's sort of a tit for tat, except that the Palestinians believed that they had already made their major compromise, what they called their historic compromise, when they gave up their claim to 78% of mandated Palestine and went for the two-state solution, a mini-state, as they called it, in the West Bank and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as the capital. And they said, we gave up 78%, and now you want to negotiate the 22%. So this symmetry was also problematic. Now, mediation is, I think, intended to overcome the asymmetry that's natural in most negotiations. But that doesn't work for us particularly either, because the mediator is the United States, and the United States has a special relationship with Israel, a special relationship. So the United States is far from being an even broker in a negotiation. It's not viewed by either side as an even broker. And even if we look at the most recent negotiations, the Kerry, what we call the Kerry Initiative, Kerry, as in past negotiations, the American negotiator goes over and over and over again to the Israelis to see what Israel will accept, to consult with the Israelis long before going to the other side. And this was something that in every case of mediation on the part of the United States, but certainly in the most recent ones, you could just count the number of meetings between Kerry and Israel and Kerry and the Palestinians. And this was not something that helped from the Palestinian point of view, certainly. Particularly, as I said, because it's not only not being an honest broker, the special relationship meant that basically, from the Palestinian point of view, America was representing Israel in negotiations. I mean, this doesn't have to be the case, of course. There have been periods when the United States exerted pressure. I wish it had happened more recently, but certainly America had offered sticks as well as carrots in 1975 and in the Camp David in 1978. And America has leverage. There's no question about it. Dan Kurtzer and others have written about, of course, what would improve American mediation and taking a more proactive role in the course of the negotiations and so on. But I think that there is another side to all of this, maybe even a crucial factor, and that's the issue in the time of negotiations of the conversation between the leaders, in our case, Israeli leaders, and the public with regard to the negotiations themselves. And what I'm hinting at is how you handle spoilers, because ultimately it's been spoilers on our side, not just on the other side, that have disrupted and ultimately defeated negotiations. Much has to do with how the leader, in our case, certainly with Yitzhak Rabin, how the leader sells the whole idea that what is being negotiated, and even if we get close to a settlement, how the leader sells that to the public. And very often what happens, and this is of course nothing new and has been written about, is that very often to sell an agreement, to persuade the public to accept it, you will often say things to placate the public which send exactly the wrong signal to the other side. And this happened, it was a classic in the negotiations between Israel and Syria, and destroyed what could have been a successful negotiation. And that is when Barak, very concerned about the public and public opinion, which was not 100% favorable to an agreement with the Syrians because people didn't want to give up the Golan Heights. Barak then boasted. He leaked a document, an American document, which had just been a draft proposal, but he boasted about what a great deal he was getting and what the Syrians were being forced to give up and the great deal Israel was getting. And Assad, the father, went ballistic. And that ended the negotiation. That ended the negotiation. And what others who were there said could have been a successful negotiation. We had a similar thing with Arafat talking about a jihad, with many misunderstandings in Israel about what is meant by a jihad. But when Arafat, placating his own people, talked about a jihad, Israel picked that up and ran with it, of course. So the rhetoric is very important, and selling an agreement or dealing with spoilers, excuse me, there are many ways to deal with that. I've just recently co-edited a book on spoilers and how to deal with spoilers. But I want to make one last point, which we saw certainly recently in the Kerry negotiations. And that is what Oliver Richmond calls the devious actor. And that's when a leader comes to negotiations with no intention of making an agreement. Does it for various reasons, maybe to buy time, maybe to placate public opinion or opponents domestically, maybe to placate outside pressure. But these devious actors, we've had them in the past, and we certainly had them with Netanyahu, of knowingly ignoring peace offers, ignoring peace offers, and even in the past lying about them, saying that they don't exist. I could give you example after example, which I find totally depressing, if not tragic, of denying a peace offer that's come along and going into negotiations with no intention of reaching an agreement. And certainly we have it now, I must say, where I guess we could call these alternative facts, where Netanyahu says very clearly and loudly the Palestinians have not changed. They've never recognized Israel. And most Israelis today believe that the Palestinians have never recognized Israel. It was in the press conference with your fellow, with Trump. He said it. Well, I mean, 1988, the Palestinians, the PLO, accepted Israel's right to exist, not just that we happen to be there, our right to exist within secure and recognized borders. And then it was put in writing with the exchange of letters prior to the Oslo Accords. But it's just totally ignoring 1988, totally ignoring the Arab Peace Initiative, and presenting Hamas at PLO as if they're one and the same thing, out to destroy us. And he said that too in the press conference. They're out to destroy us. You do not have a Palestinian leader today in the PLO or in the Palestinian Authority who says anything but a two-state solution. And yet, most people, I think, in Israel, or a large proportion, believe what Bibi is saying, what Netanyahu is saying, is that it's not the occupation the Palestinians are objecting to, it's Jews. It's anti-Semitism. So for Netanyahu, I think negotiations are interesting as a process. With the present government, it may be that even that is not acceptable, and negotiating might be seen by Netanyahu's colleagues in the coalition as not particularly productive. I do think that Netanyahu wants a regional negotiation, and he talked about that also, but I think that's so that the hope is that we can then be talking to the Arab states, to Saudi Arabia in particular, get that kind of acceptance in the region without dealing with the Palestinian issue. I don't know an Arab state that will go to a regional conference with Israel without talking about a resolution of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And finally, I just want to say that I found, and I think remains, that the major factor when everything else is done and said is this political will, where the leader is. If the leader has the political will to go through with an agreement, to reach an agreement, is determined to reach an agreement, and this, I think, depends in turn on a leader's concept of leadership, whether you follow the public, which was Balak's problem, or you lead the public, which was Rabin's attitude, Olmert's attitude. This concept of leadership is critical to political will. If you have that political will, and of course there are many, many circumstances and factors that lay behind that very critical thing. What brings about this political will? And for that, I need another 15, 20 minutes. Thank you.
Well, let me begin by thanking everyone coming, and also Dr. Zartman and the Conflict Management Program for putting together this event. As we can see, wonderful sort of set of ideas about what are the possibilities and challenges of dealing with conflicts and specific conflicts. So let me just add by sort of giving some broader ideas about where I would see some of the issues might be given the change of administration in the U.S. I think at the sort of a very macro level, when you particularly go outside of the United States and listen to concerns outside, is that the context in which resolution of conflicts or encountering conflicts had taken place or expected to take place has now clearly shifted. And that particularly the assault on globalization, on trade, on the sort of the economic context, the sense of global community that could have served as a brake on a set of conflicts or provided an incentive for engagement of actors in certain conflicts in order to bring an end to them is no longer there. The rise of illiberal nationalism, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe, is a source of worry. Largely, many think outside that it actually gives greater license to pursuing very narrow nationalist agendas in pushing for conflicts. And of course, the rhetoric that the United States has put on the table, America first, or if it's sort of universalized into me first, is suggestive of much more of a zero-sum approach to conflicts as they go forward. And one way, at least, it's being articulated is that there's now, in the current context, there's more reason to fight than to stop fighting. There's more incentives on the table for gaining as much as possible through conflicts than prospects of what might be taken from a settlement. And in particular, examples I've heard are those that were ideas of being included into international trade systems, being included into a European community, being included into a broader international community was part of an incentive for ending conflicts, is no longer as credible, as tangible, particularly when even the future of an entity like European Union or inclusion into broader trade agreements is no longer there. One other sort of facet that is perhaps worrisome, but is very much on people's radars, is that the chaos in Washington in decision-making and the vacuum, if you would, in a palpable vacuum in decision-making is not really an incentive for ending conflicts, but maybe actually an accelerator in terms of trying to get as much as possible before adults return to run things. No, I mean, I'm not being facetious. That's literally ways in which people see it, that in the very short run, the way in which Washington works, the palpable chaos actually creates an opportunity to drive harder. So, going back to our last speaker, why not build more settlements as quickly as possible where nobody's actually in the State Department to pick up the phone and actually object. And so, you can create facts on the ground that then would become established. Now, that of course goes from something as small as building more settlements to potentially issues that have to do with territory or getting certain advantages that create instability. The second issue, at a larger level, is that where there are adults in or I would say responsible stakeholders in Washington, they tend to come now predominantly from the military, and particularly in the White House. And that's not only at the level of senior military leaders and generals, but a lot of the lower ranks are also colonels, and this sort of militarization of America's foreign policy that's now being reflected even in budget distribution, as Tom mentioned, suggests that there's a certain kind of corporate identity or corporate sort of way of thinking about world problems is going to dominate in Washington that doesn't favor diplomats or diplomatic solutions to problems. And not to say that militaries don't engage in negotiations, but they approach the negotiations and from a very different vantage point as diplomats do. I mean, we already had a problem between the balance of power between the military and diplomats. It was something that President Obama actually problematized very much in his own approach to foreign policy, but it's very clear, particularly outside the United States, that balance has been sort of lost, at least within this administration, in a very, very clear, palpable way. And I was in Europe recently, and sort of there's a deafening silence at the State Department, and which is very, very noticeable that the Secretary of State is not engaged in a lot of the opinions that are being laid out, that the Department of State is actually not manned, and assistant secretaries are not in place, under secretaries not in place, deputies are not in place, and that all of that is suggestive that key decisions very early on in terms of structure, process, strategy, to the extent that exist, are not being made with influence of the diplomats, and that might create a sort of a much more permanent imbalance that would be consequential going forward. But it also saps the U.S.'s at least certain degree of moral authority in approaching, I think, conflict resolution going forward. The third issue, sort of at a larger level, is what the Trump administration has really put on the table in a big way, is basically resetting the world order, and in a larger way of redefining who are America's fundamental allies and who are its fundamental enemies. And some of this has been jarring and counterintuitive in the way in which the foreign policy establishment across the aisles thinks about it, that, that Europe somehow is, or European Union is not, if not an enemy or not an adversary, is definitely not an asset to the United States. Certain elements of the administration would like the European Union to go away and may be willing to even provide a lending hand to that, and that rather Russia is actually America's natural ally in confronting a lot of global problems, and China should be treated much more singularly as a threat or as a strategic counterpoint to the United States. Now, these are sort of big ideas, sort of Kissingerian, sort of ideas about balance of power, about rebalancing. Is much grander than and much more sort of sharp on its edges than President Obama's notion of pivoting to Asia, which did not have this sort of same kind of conflictual tones to it. Now, the interesting thing about this sort of resetting is that and you hear this again outside, it connotes that the most important negotiations perhaps is going to be at the most macro level, right? It is about grand bargains. Can there be a grand bargain between Russia and the United States over division, not just division of power in Syria or Ukraine, but over division of power in Europe, the future of NATO, the future of Europe, and can there be a grand bargain between the United States and China, which would then decide many things in Asia, from trade to South China Sea, East China Sea, North Korea, etc. Now, these are sort of tantalizing ideas. But there are, as to the charge of our moderator, if we thought about what are the challenges here. One is that sort of approaching these large conflicts can actually unleash a lot more smaller conflicts. I mean, this kind of rebalancing, at least President Obama was trying it in one theater in the world, in Asia, trying to do it in Europe. In Asia at the same time, abandoning allies that have been the sort of transatlantic alliance that has been the mainstay of the post-World War II order for us, and trying to replace it with something else, will by definition be turbulent, and it could unleash many different sort of conflicts. So trying to settle the larger conflicts can unleash many smaller conflicts. It can also send signals that may not be hopeful. Again, going back to the last piece of the conversation about the Arab-Israeli issue, sort of the idea of a mini rebalancing that the administration is promoting, of trying to create an Arab-Israeli alliance around opposition to Iran. The end result of which actually the administration is hopeful would be an Arab recognition of Israel, despite the promise to move the capital to Jerusalem, expand settlements, and send a particularly, I would say, challenging ambassador to Israel, as far as the Arabs are concerned, at least. Despite all of these, this idea that somehow there can be a grand bargain between the Arabs and Israelis at the cost of, because Iran is such a strategic bogey, in the least may send a very signals to the Israeli government in terms of balance of power vis-a-vis the Arabs. So if the assumption is that Iran is a much more important factor for Arab governments than the Palestinians are, you hear comments like the Israeli defense minister in Munich saying, yeah, Arabs don't care about Palestine. They care about Iran. And therefore, Israel really doesn't have any pressure on it as far as the Palestinians are issued. There's no international pressure. There's no regional pressure. But in fact, it can basically have its cake and eat it too. It can have what it wants in terms of territory, settlements, final solution, but at the same time get the recognition and support that it wants, and the Palestinians will end up with no sort of a strategic umbrella in the region. Now, that would make for a very different conversation at the table, and you go beyond devious actors to completely obdurate actors, and actually it's very difficult to see how there will be any peace process if Israel doesn't even see the necessity for it. And that's a consequence of this sort of grand bargain language that the administration is promoting without actually calling it that, but it's essentially trying to revamp the strategic map in many places, which then would change the context for many of the conflicts. Now, to this you can add that it is a problem that you're trying to do strategy without having strategic vision. In other words, everybody understands that what the administration is really putting on the table is completely changing the nature of transatlantic relations and US-Russia relations, or rebuilding the Middle East completely. But it's unable to articulate this or put it in a way forward that other people can actually build their policies around it. And that actually is creating much more guessing, hedging, and worry. It is also problematic when it's not clear what are the administration, the US administration's leverage here. What is it actually going to offer Russia? And what is it going to get from Russia? Right? I mean, if you talk to the Europeans, they would say, okay, you're offering them Syria, which technically President Obama went to great lengths to say we really don't have a vital interest in it. Right? So Trump administration is almost intimating that we do have a vital interest in Syria, and we think the Russians do. So we're willing to give them a peace deal for Ukraine in exchange for something in Syria that neither we care about nor they care about. So it almost sounds like a gift. Or similarly with China. So what is the administration's leverage? There might be leverage in forms of trade, et cetera, but it's not articulated what that leverage is, and therefore, how do you negotiate, and what is it that you're putting on the table? And then also there is a sense that, it's one thing when you say, the Tom Pickerings or the Zbigniew Brzezinskis or the Kissinger of the world are going to be managing these, as opposed to the current sort of administration trying to manage the strategy. And there's a perception that the administration actually does not have the capacity, both in terms of manpower and in terms of the audacity of the rearrangement of global strategic scene that it's taken on, to actually do anything other than create chaos. That, simultaneous grand bargain with the Russians, Chinese, Europeans in the Middle East is beyond the capacity of the best of administrations, let alone this one. And I think that is, again, what a sense is that is actually going to encourage a lot more sort of hedging, a lot more freelancing by different actors, and a lot more conflict, and much less capability on the part of the international system to prevent these conflicts, to manage these conflicts, and then to end these conflicts. So let me just end by sort of going to points that Tom raised about the Middle East. Now, the Middle East matters because it's going to provide a particular set of challenges and conflicts that would be on our radar going forward. So correctly, Tom identified Syria, and I would add to it Iraq, as places that are going to need some form of a serious approach to negotiation. So after ISIS is gone, or after Mosul is liberated, the key question is, how do you decide the future of Syria and Iraq? Are they going to be one country, or are they going to be many countries? Are the Kurds going to be independent, or are they going to stay in? Or is this going to be a hyper-federated, cantonized nation state, or is it going to be a unitary state? And that would require, of course, some serious negotiations, which Secretary Kerry had tried to do without leverage for some time, and now at some point, if the Trump administration would have to confront this issue. I mean, their approach to this is that we're just going to make nice with Russia, and therefore there's nothing to negotiate with. We'll just both be in agreement about an outcome. Now, the problem is that, I'm not actually sure that US and Russian interests are aligned in the Middle East. Secondly, it's not a given that the Russians or Russia plus America can actually address the diverse set of interests in the region without, again, serious negotiations. Because we forget that end of the day, Russia and the United States don't live in the Middle East. All the countries around Syria and Iraq have to live with the consequences of a deal for the rest of their lives. So they care about it much more. And there's no way to see that currently that either Iran wins or the Saudi-Sunni alliance wins. And as you said, you have to give them something in order to balance this out. This requires all of the issues that you raised. And then, as Tom mentioned, the Iran-Saudi issue is sort of a very, I think it's one of those places where it's not sort of a conflict within a territory, but it's much more of a regional conflict of the kind that we've dealt with before, of trying to reduce tension. It's much more like a Greece-Turkey conflict of a different time period. And here, the solutions are not that simple. So the Saudis have obviously adopted a very tough position on Iran. Basically, what they want is Iran for the United States to basically remove Iran from the region, put it in its own country, create a containment wall, and hand over Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen to Saudi Arabia and its allies on a silver platter. That literally is their sort of ideal position. But at the same time, I think they are also hedging the idea of making another offer to Iran in the form of a Kuwaiti delegation to Tehran suggests that they're not quite sure that the Trump administration would do that, and they ought to at least explore a plan B, which might be some form of an opening with Iran. But the Saudis have the same dilemma that, let's say, the Palestinians have in dealing with the Israelis, which is they have the weaker hand. You can go to the negotiating table, but they obviously, the Iranians control more territory, hold more of the cards, and are more militarily even confident, especially given the poor performance of the Saudi military in Yemen, and that any negotiation at this point in time is not likely to arrive anywhere near what the Saudis want. And I think the Saudis would like the U.S. military or the U.S. government to bring Iranians down a notch or two before they go to the table. Something like, Sadat having to go to war in '73 before he could, engage the Israelis, because you couldn't go to the table with the humiliation of 1967. Now, that course of action is very different from where the Obama administration was going, which was trying to balance the relation with the Arabs with a relationship with Iran, a confrontation between U.S. and Iran, which now increasingly seems like, this administration is signing up to, and in some ways is also goaded by Israel to do so, because Israel has a different agenda, which is that the more Iran becomes problematic, the more likely it is that the Arabs would have to accept whatever Israel gives on the Palestinians in order to build an alliance, has consequences. It could actually unleash many more conflicts in Iraq and Syria. I mean, pretty much, I think, Iraq will explode as a consequence of U.S.-Iran confrontation, and also the nuclear deal may be put on life support, if not completely out of commission, and that would undo, if you would, a major negotiation victory of the previous administration. It also sort of raises an interesting question, which nowadays we have to ask literally about whatever we talk, which is what about Russia? So the Russians are now a very big player in the Middle East. The administration's trying to make nice with Russia at the same time as it wants to go against Russia's biggest ally in the region, which is Iran. And that's sort of a level of complication which I don't think the administration is yet ready to actually put its mind around. But let me stop over there and you can continue.
Remarks on what Molly
Absolutely,
said.
So I would like to
Yeah.
open this then to an exchange among the four panelists. And Tom, you,
I just want to thank Vali both for elevating the dialogue to the American political scene, which I think all of us had felt a certain trepidation about, but we were very careful to bring it forward in a useful way. I have several brief thoughts that I think temper a little bit of what you said. The structural coherence of your academic analysis is belied by the virtual realities that are demonstrated daily by the administration. And so, in effect, things like chaos are part and parcel of three tendencies. Mr. Trump's own egomaniacal fascination with himself, the second circle of Mr. Bannon and his views that somewhere to the right of the right are about to descend upon us as the rediscovery of a new, narrow, white-dominated nationalism in the United States. And what I call the third circle of reasonably sensible people brought up on the lessons of the Cold War and what we like to call the liberal progressive analysis of the situation. Mattis, Kelly to some extent, perhaps McMaster, maybe Tillerson, maybe Dan Coates. And so the chaos is a product of the differences as well as the personal leadership, as well as what I would call the ideological predispositions of the middle group, not widely shared by the other two. And so it is the conflict between them as well as the conflict in their ideas that adds to this. And so we can expect at the moment, as a minority government by the grace of the Electoral College in power, in some sense, to have created what I think is the exact opposite of the public perception generated frequently by the president. This is a well-oiled machine, and we see that. I think to add to your analysis, there is a sense of deep commitment to bilateralism coming out of the entrepreneurial world, where you rarely negotiate with three firms at the same time. And I think that's driving some of the, what I would call, clearly from your perspective, rightly, unreality about the present situation, which takes me to my final point. Is it realistic to believe that should this continue and one doesn't see ready-to-hand changes taking place day by day in the three contenders for attention here, is it realistic to believe that it has a half-life of 4 years? And that is certainly a deep subject of conversation at the moment. And just 2 or 3 points. That is in the hands, in my humble view, of the Republican Party, for reasons I don't have to go into with you all. The second piece is, will the destruction of our national interests produced by a chaotic administration cross soon enough the curve of Republican frustration about their future survival as a party as a result of the record being created by them and for them under current circumstances? And will the third curve that is out there that I think is very important, a curve that has suddenly appeared in the New York Times editorial today on infrastructure, and that's the curve of the support base that helped to put in power the present administration, which up until now has, I think, fed on and put it this way, re-energized its own remarkable capacity for self-deception on what are essentially the promises rather than the deliveries. And so can the deliveries come soon enough either to prolong the Republican Party curve or the national destruction curve, or will those curves cross earlier and you will have a very disgruntled, we was robbed group of people who happen in many cases to belong to and support the NRA and all it stands for with the use of weapons for self-defense. And does this bring us chaos and calamity, insurgency, and other difficulties? I don't know the answer to any of those questions, but I worry about them because much of what you said, I think, drives us, unfortunately, more into that direction in terms of the national workout. Final point, the national workout doesn't look like it will come through resignation, not at this early point. Anybody who analyzes the 25th Amendment cannot believe at this stage that since it depends upon judgments about capacity to conduct office, is of anything more only likely to appeal to the well-established group of psychiatrists who've signed on, but unlikely to produce what I would call enough grist for the Republican mill. And so we are up against the question of high crimes and misdemeanors and impeachment as an approach which I don't know where it will go. And I have no, sense of whether, in fact, that will come. But to some extent, in my case, there is a remarkable indulgence in self-deception that, in fact, the points that you paint so beautifully, even as incoherent as they are as a formula because they are not coherent in the minds of the people propounding them, will they, in effect, become the kind of damaging certainty that we have, and can we survive 4 years of it?
Can I just make a comment on chaos? Because one thing I think, and if you listen to Steve Bannon's comments at CPAC, the emphasis on deconstructing.
Yeah.
And in that approach, chaos is an ally. That you accept the chaos.
It's a tool.
Yeah, it's a tool. And out of the chaos, you can then rebuild what it is you want to do. The danger, of course, is that when chaos occurs, it often runs amok, out of control.
It's often very chaotic.
It's often, and that I think is it's not that the administration may stumble into chaos. It may say chaos is good in certain dimensions. Chaos in the State Department is good because we're going to reconstruct it. And chaos in the world is okay, as long as it isn't directly against us. And to the extent that we're prepared to tolerate, as a country, a lot of chaos in this administration, then the question is what the outcome of that chaos can be. And it could run out of control, or it just could be a lot of prices being paid in lots of places in the world. If you wanted to take an optimistic approach or find a silver lining in this, you could say that with that approach coming from the United States, and not only the acceptance, but even the promotion of chaos, that the rest of the world has to take on more responsibility, that they have to rise to the occasion to counter that with solutions to the chaos, whether it's regionally, whether it's in the larger issues that you've both talked about. If there's a silver lining in it, it's to force the rest of the world to say, we've got to pick up where the United States is not.
I think you're totally wrong. There's no silver lining. It's the analogy that you gave in terms of how to deal with the problems of people and development. You basically said R2P, if it is turned in, and I hate to use this phrase because you'll understand the pun in it, nothing to P.
Oh, God. Thank you.
Isn't going to work. But what you've got here is essentially a situation where one of the three circles has this as a strategic objective. The other two circles, the one-man circle is contributing to it by natural inclination. And the third circle, in my view, has to reject it, which in effect means that the three circles together are producing the bad result. And so it is a kind of internal, nasty, circular spiral of self-infection that's going on here.
I wanted to relate to that very briefly. I'm always supremely impressed when people describe or present this administration's foreign policy. I really am. I mean, I think it's a feat.
Yes.
I'll just stop with that. But I had the same reaction as you, exactly the same reaction. I thought, okay, the relationship between the United States and Europe is now clearly changing. It's going to change. And I was very hopeful. I thought this meant that Europe would take a different position on its own, no longer has to bow to the United States and EU decisions on our issues, certainly. And I saw that as a good thing until about 2 weeks ago, I spoke with some officials from the EU, and they said, don't expect it. Don't expect it. We're not going to take the place of the United States, the Middle East, for example. It's not going to happen. Now, I'd like to think that that was their opinion. But one of the things that I really wanted to hear more in your own analyses is about Europe, because I think Europe is our hope. And my last thing is that I wanted to talk to you. I'm a former Soviet specialist, but I don't deal with Russia. But I've had this sort of nagging concern. How is this administration, whoever they are, going to how are they going to maneuver between Russia and Iran? And you touched on this, but you said you wouldn't go into it, but I'd like to go into it more. I don't see, because this whole, the bounce, this grand deal between the United States and Russia, it's not the same as détente. It's not the old, because the old system, the détente, could handle these things. But that's not, assuming that there is a coherent policy, and that there is a move towards Russia, a grand deal with Russia, and it's anti-Iran, clearly. Assuming that, I don't see how this is going to play out. I mean, I agree that all the signs that there are differences of opinion in the White House, and I don't know what Steve Bannon thinks about these countries. I'd rather he thought about these countries than he thought about the United States.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think you raised some interesting issues, which is, and I think to take Tom's point, at this point in time, chaos is both the product of this administration and maybe it's also its intended ammunition as well. But you're in a very peculiar place where foreign leaders and foreign policymakers put a lot more weight on what the president tweets or on sort of throwaway statements that are made rather than sort of coherent foreign policy analysis that happens at lower levels of government, like, say, assistant secretaries talking to each other and trying to sort out where do you stand, let's say, on this issue. So, you know, I would say at this stage, it's very interesting to think about that what the administration intends to say or what it articulates as foreign policy might be different from the way it is understood. And I think when other countries hedge or react, sort of they react to their own interpretation. So the administration has not articulated very clearly a position on China. But the assumption in much of Asia is that the administration is going down the path of renegotiating trade and trade imbalance with China. So the worry that creates is that the rest of Asia is on the table. The administration has never said this. In fact, it's been very warm and welcoming to Prime Minister Abe, but you know, the Japanese foreign policy establishment think that if there is ever a conversation about a broader topic, which seems to be the president's hinting at it, or his, as Tom says, that sort of is the private sector mindset that you create a single deal. That of course Japan is going to be, or Japan's security, or issues that infringe on Japan's security are going to be on the table, but the Japanese will not be at the table, because as Tom correctly points out, that's not the way in which they approach this. So their understanding is that that some grander grander bargain may happen. If under Obama administration, the chance of that was 2%, now the chance of that is 32%, right? And so they begin to sort of shape their policies around that. And I think that there's a sort of a law of unintended consequence. And I want to sort of emphasize that you don't have big thinkers. I don't know about Bannon. Maybe he might have the intellect and the sort of time on his hand to have thought about these. But a lot of other people who should be doing these thinkings are actually not appointed to their positions. And the General Flynn did articulate some of these ideas that, you know, our greatest threat is China, and, you know, our natural ally is Russia, but, you know, then he's gone. But I think, you know, you're in a situation where you're right, the administration may not quite understand this sort of grand vision, but that's the way it's being interpreted. And, you know, multipolarity with it also has certain dangers, because a lot of conflicts have been limited, negotiated, mediated in the structure of a sort of a unipolar world that the US dominated, or a US-European world that they dominated. And as this sort of we adjust in these fissures, you know, there might be more opportunity. I actually think at least on the surface, the way the administration thinks about Russia is not quite understanding what the Russians' interests might be. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not limited to this administration. I think actually the previous administration got Russia wrong in a big way as well. And I think the audacity of a country that is willing to take down Europe and challenge, you know, democracy, you know, suggests that it has bigger ambitions or bigger issues that it wants to resolve than just having a port on the Mediterranean with Syria. And also, I think to that extent, we don't quite understand the nature of Russian-Iranian relationship. But, you know, again, Iranians also think the same way as the Japanese do. So if Trump went to Putin and said, I really, really want you to abandon the Iranians. Uh-huh. So there might be a price point. The price point may, you can imagine, what is it that Putin might ask for that, right? Is it Ukraine? Is it NATO? Is it the Baltic states?
I think it's more likely that Putin will ask Trump to.
that as well, but no, you're right. But you know, the sort of the nature of these things is not quite understood unless we really figure out what is Russia's strategic interest, true strategic interest, rather than, I think the mistake on the Obama administration, we would constantly try to articulate what we think the Russians think, and we try to do it in a way that would minimize the need for us to react to it. Right? And that was sort of a self-defeating approach.
I think, you know, Vali, we're getting to the end, but I think you clearly point out that at the moment, the administration is distinctly unrelieved by any knowledge of facts or details beyond the most superficial. And a lot of administrations come in at that basis, but they have the support mechanisms and others to help them. This one seems to be disdaining that. Secondly, as we all know, in governance, there is always a conflict between ideology and pragmatism. And everyone struggles for an ideology that comprehends the greatest amount of pragmatic choice, if they can. Although new ideologies come full-blown, Bannon is one of them, with a disdain for knowledge, choice, facts and figures, and totally mesmerized by a conceptual approach which they feel in the deeper sense of their emotional commitment is exactly right. And you can't certainly disdain them for their commitment to the ideas, even if the ideas bear very little relationship to the reality. And I think we're moving toward a great deal of unreality at the moment in a number of places. And a really interesting question is, can that produce useful governance over a long period of time, particularly as chaos is a central feature, at least, of some of the views about how to do that? And is that in our national interest, and can we put up with that? Will the rest of the world, to take Princeton Silver Lining, come to our rescue? I think hardly likely. They will come to the rescue of themselves and probably hunker down and close in and maybe fractionate, but not want to assume a lot of leadership. But there, the door is now open to China and maybe to some extent to Russia. And so one wonders, one can go through enormous numbers of really fascinating permutations and combinations with what is essentially the kaleidoscopic effect of what people are now saying, doing, and not doing in respect to the United States. And so our leadership is challenged at the present time in a very serious way. And the most formidable opponents to our leadership is, of course, ourselves.
I would hate to lead that as the closing statement. And we're over time, but we began a little over time, so with permission, begin with a batch of questions, and that will be the last round. Yes, in the gray second row, yeah.
Thank you very much for all of your perspectives, for sharing your perspectives. I'm a second-year MA student at SAIS, studying
quit.
international development.
Don't quit, yeah.
My question is directed towards Ambassador Pickering. As a Ukrainian American, prior to the conflict that led to the uprising against Yanukovych, I thought that the brightest future of Ukraine lay as a sort of Switzerland of Eastern Europe. I didn't understand why the association agreement with the EU was mutually exclusive with the Russian trade agreement, and it seemed to me that both sides could have gained from partnership over Ukraine. While it's a little blasphemous in Ukrainian
Can you
circles
come
to
to
say
the
this,
question?
yes, sorry. The loss of Crimea actually may serve as a catalyst for a stronger and more unified Ukrainian state that both sides can agree on. However, do you believe that Russia sees more of a threat in a prosperous Ukrainian state than it does in the end of conflict that is costing itself thousands, or if not millions of dollars in the lives of its own soldiers?
No, what Russia feels...
Come, let me take a couple questions.
All right,
and then we'll...
but I just give him a one-sentence answer and you get rid of it.
Can you give me
What Russia feels is an alienated and opposing Ukraine.
John?
Ambassador Pickering, I wonder to what extent you see the three generals as a fourth circle.
I said they're the third circle, if you're talking about the same three generals as I am. Within the third circle, are they a fourth circle of militarism? No, but I think that the military will dominate the third circle for the foreseeable future.
In the back there, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Just quickly for the panel, but related to Dean Nasr's point about the future of relationships and transatlantic relationships, but also in the Asia-Pacific and other places where the United States has friends, ostensibly at this point, friends and allies. Do you see those relationships surviving, granted the unpredictability that is obviously present in the administration's actions, the next 4 years, or do they all of a sudden, does their perception of America shift as a result of things that may occur that damage their interests?
Okay, let me get one more and we can, yes. Gather things together.
Thank you. Just following up on that question, we talked about how China and Russia may be changing the rules of the game and the balance of power during this period of time. If you're a small state, whether in East Asia, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, what leverage do you have during this period of time? Or do you bow towards the power in your region because of your basic interests? And how would this impact the US in the next administration? Thank you.
Okay, let me go down the panel because this is the last word and they have the answer to the last word.
Well, I think all states, small or large, will ultimately look after their own interests. And if they think that the United States has proven that it's not a sort of a constant, that you can expect that like sun rises on the east every day and sets on the west, that the countries will begin to hedge more. Some might have to do more. In other words, Asian countries will probably now be much more receptive to a China-led trade agreement, might be much less eager to adopt a confrontational posture on South China Sea and the like. But I think even other countries will begin to sort of think in terms of how do they pursue their interest in a new environment, and that might take them down paths that we might not be comfortable with.
Princeton?
Let me pick up on the Asia question, because one thing we haven't had a chance to discuss is the North Korean issue. Because the administration's approach to China so far has been very much in terms of the trade issues, et cetera. But the North Korean issue affects much of Asia. And it's an issue around which you could build consensus. And I think the administration will have to work out where its leverages as well as its emphasis is with China, vis-a-vis North Korea on the one hand, trade and those issues on the other, and they're not tradable. They're very different. And that's an issue in which seems to me, among these circles that Tom has mentioned, that hasn't been joined yet in a way that seems to me is going to define a lot of how this administration deals with Asia.
I must say, I take a sort of broader view of all this. I think that they're going to be almost unimaginable at this point in time repercussions or effects. First of all, I think Russia's been given a tremendous gift. And I mean, well beyond what they deserved in terms of their own capabilities. And I think I wouldn't want to be Estonia, for example. I think we're going to see. I think we're going to see this advantage used. But I tend to think that there are going to be things that we can't even think of now, because I grant you, America seemed to be many felt that under Obama, America was pulling out of certain areas in terms of influence and moving into others. But this is an entirely different ballgame. And I'm not sure that we can even see at the moment where it's going to go in terms of international relations. I, for one, am very frightened. Because I look at this administration and I see Germany in the early 1930s, except, of course, there are differences as well. I really cannot, I have no picture of where this can go, but I think if it's unchecked here in Washington, I think it can have repercussions that our rational analyses have not taken into account.
On small states, I agree with Vali. They're going to have to more hunker down, and if the U.S. isn't around to help lead the charge to use the kind of values we share as a basis for protecting them, then I think there'll be a lot more fractionation. And maybe some movement toward China. We saw this morning the beginning of a new trade arrangement to replace TTP. I think on the other question, if you can tell me how long the present administration will go on for the future as it has in the last 27 days, I will tell you how disastrous the damage will be to the international community and to ourselves. But it's only a question there of measuring time. That raises one other question. Will the present administration change? And those of the silver lining school believe it may. I don't believe the leader will change, but the leader isn't always necessary to change the administration. President Reagan was a remarkable example of that. And his view was laissez-faire, except for 4 or 5 issues I'm most interested in. I don't see the present leader moving in that mold. The other alternative is, in fact, that a group of people who have either delegated or who have assumed that they are delegated serious responsibilities will in some ways or another put the administration on a course that deals with reality in a hard way and away from extreme ideology. Those, in my view, are not yet indicated by the cards that I have seen played, but we can always hope. And my view is, if you're a praying person, pray.
If I
agree
can
with that.
close this on a commercial, I think it's clear from this very animated discussion and helpful one that we need more people seriously studying conflict management. Thank you.
Indeed. Well, thank you.
Because it's right here at home, growing.